Welcome, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining me on another episode of Talking Cloud. Now, you know, this is where we talk about cloud computing, anything cloud, all things cloud, because isn't that everything in our computing environments anyway? Cloud? I mean, what aspect of computing doesn't involve cloud? I mean, it's in everything we're doing, from IoT to shifting data centers into the cloud, public, private. The list goes on and on. Now, you know I'm no expert, but I got a good line into a lot of great ones. And man, I'm so excited today because I get to talk to somebody that really, I think, has had his hands deep into it for a long, long time. I mean, anytime you see the name Tandy on someone's resume back in the 90s doing support, you know they've been around for a long time. And certainly Mike has deep in experience with regards to support, network services, security, all the way up the ladder into a long time at Cisco, was essentially director of professional services, a very key solutions architect for a long time, went to Visa. I mean, the guy's pretty impressive. Gartner has now landed and is currently the service director. It looks like service director, security, architecture, and engineering. I guess I'll let him give all the details, but he's at a company called Trace3. I'm thrilled. I've only met him a short time ago. In fact, a mutual friend, my longtime friend, Robbie Elliott, introduced me to him, said he'd be a great guest. And knowing Robbie like I do, I know this is going to be a great session. I already had a brief conversation with Mike to meet him a week ago, and I'm absolutely thrilled and excited to have him on the program today. Mike Morrato, thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome. So, hey, I always kind of put it up this way. Let's give the audience a bit of your Z-axis, if you will, some perspective on Mike. I mean, I kind of rambled off on your background, but maybe you can give us a little bit more clarity there.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because I hadn't actually used the word Tandy for quite some time. But I've been in the game for about 29 years now. It will be 30 years this September.
Congrats.
And thank you. And I've sort of climbed up the ladder. You know, I got my early breaks unpaid, helping build my high school's network back in the very early 90s before networking was truly a discipline.
Right. That was back when, the way I put that is that was back when everyone was networking, although I guess it was post this era. You remember when everyone was networking, but they were all using their own protocol.
Exactly.
or it wasn't their own, but there were so many varied that there really wasn't ever a thread of outside of my network like there is today, right? It was,
correct.
I kind of say it was, we were in our own little lake or pond as opposed to all of a sudden, boom, we're in the ocean with predator and prey.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. Well, and that even the cabling was different back in the, because my first run of cabling was doing thick net and thin net. So the old school where you had to put connectors or terminators on the end of the wire, otherwise all the electrons dropped out of the wire. So
and remember what an emphasis we had on that aspect of the connectivity. The networking, right? I mean, that was all about the networking. And it's interesting, right, how we've definitely, like cream, floated to the top.
It is funny how that's worked out, and we discovered what did work and what didn't work. To make matters worse, I also got my start on token rings. So my first foray wasn't even on Ethernet, because Ethernet was still an unfinished standard when we started. At least 100 meg was.
Yep.
But started out doing that. Impressed a guy who eventually became my boss, who ran in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is where I was born and raised. He ran the Radio Shack Computer Center, so it wasn't just your everyday Radio Shack hobbyist shop. It was the actual computer center, and he's like, "Okay, whiz kid, why don't you come run our upgrades desk?" And so, started off doing installing the hard drives, installing operating systems, putting in network cards, and loading up the NetWare drivers in your auto exec and config. And from there, just stayed at Tandy in various roles, or RadioShack.com, I guess, is eventually what they settled on. By the time it was Tandy Corp, and did a stint at Computer City and Incredible Universe, and then got into the more real world of computing, and started my climb through the .com eras.
That was what happened. I mean, and I know you know this, Mike, but I was around. I helped open up an Apple dealership in 1983, and so what we saw when Tandy and Computer City and CompUSA were out, that was really the burgeoning bifurcation, if you will, when it went out of being a computer store that you went to and really became a consumer commoditized appliance product, right? Or value-added services.
Right. And it was a crazy time because, I've had a computer since the early 80s. I mean, my dad got an old 8088. At the time, it was really high tech. But, having a computer, even when I had my 386 and 486, that was still somewhat in the niche of nerddom, if we're being honest. I mean, it just wasn't that, to your point, commoditized technology that we had. And then just to add more to the nerd cred is, starting off with a 300 baud acoustic coupler. So I was doing the modem and the online stuff long before there was an internet.
Dungeons and Dragons, bulletin boards, man. Yeah.
and
CompuServe, the source. Yes. I remember them well.
Mail. Yeah. Good old Amazon free discs as well. Or not Amazon, AOL.
Yes.
Yeah, it was crazy times. But, and then sometime around 94 and 95, which was conversely when I was in college as well, we saw an explosion of computers coming online. That's when you started to see the .com addresses on the tail end of commercials. I still remember the first one I saw was for a Magnavox TV, and it says find more information at magnavox.com, and you go there and it was just it was your stereotypical mid-90s website with complete with MIDI music and
it's a piece of paper that has now been produced electronically, right? I mean,
exactly.
It's so funny. But that was remarkable, I'll bet, when you saw it. It's like, oh, wow.
Yeah. It was interesting seeing technology grow up, and something that I had been doing, granted via a different format, because HTML and browsers weren't necessarily a thing in the late 80s and the early 90s. It was more the mid 90s that those really came to their maturity. And I also just want to throw out there, remember paying for Netscape Navigator, $24.99 to buy the box of Netscape before it became free. But seeing that come to life, and then seeing a lot of the advantages that I had as someone who had adopted computing and just electronic communications for years become sort of the new standard, especially when I was in college, and seeing that transition from having to go to the professor and wait your turn in line to being able to send your professor an email or go to the professor's homepage, as everyone used to call it back then, and get the lesson plans or understand what was talked about in class that day, or even transforming news groups and NTP groups to being study groups where people could upload their notes. It became a thing, and it was really cool. It was brand new. It wasn't quite to the craziness that we have today, obviously, but it was interesting seeing that all come to fruition. It was kind of fun being on the front end of that.
Heck yeah, man. I mean, that's one of the things I always say. My Andy Warhol 15 minutes of fame in this industry was that the first Macintosh computer that Alaska Airlines and Weyerhaeuser and a handful of other companies, the first person they bought it from was me. I sold it to them. So, that's kind of cool. Opened Apple's office in Anchorage, Alaska. Kind of fun. But isn't it amazing how It's how things have changed. Okay, so then I noticed, you did some stuff at Visa and you did some stuff at Gartner,
Yep.
kind of moved up the ladder continually, right?
Yeah, throughout the rest of the 90s, I did the .com thing. And then I went to Cisco for 13 years. I originally went to Cisco as an SE. I just saw the writing on the wall. I was doing a company that we actually ran the original NFL shop way back in 2000. So we're going back 21 years here. But we ran the original NFL shop. We ran one of the eyeglasses place. I forget the eyeglass company. They're still around. I forget if it was Pearl or one of those types. But more retail eyeglass companies as well. We were in ASP, but I saw the writing on the wall. I had been jumping job to job to job like everyone else did in the .com era, just because it was insanely profitable to stay somewhere for 6 months and then switch jobs and get a $30,000, $40,000 raise and do that over again. But eventually I saw the writing on the wall and had a friend at Cisco, and he said, come on in. And I started off as an SE, and that was a shock to the system because I had a pretty fast rise through the ranks in the .com era. Just, I had the networking skills, I had the system skills, I had the security understanding to go in something that was much more static and much more fixed in its scope at Cisco. Did the SE thing for about 2-3 years, and then I switched over to the services side where I did delivery for a couple of years, and then I did a combination of delivery and leadership for the last 9 years of that, which I'm not going to lie, to this date is still one of my favorite jobs. It's not something I'd go back and do again, but it was something that I really learned a lot. I learned a lot about managing those projects, managing customer expectations, dealing with literally millions of dollars worth of both budget and kit, and the importance of making sure you're doing it right and the quality control of that. Really listening to and talking to customers to make sure you get what they need right the first time versus delivering something and completely missing the mark. And unfortunately, I still see that happening in the market today, but it was something I took to heart back then. And then just, after 13 years, you don't stay somewhere 13 years and hate it. So I loved it, but it was just time to move on. The opportunity was right, and Visa had come after me because I was doing a lot of work in the financial sector space, and they'd gotten my name through one of my contacts at one of the Canadian banks that I was working at while I was at Cisco, and they said, come on in. They had me come in at a senior director role, running a lot of the network security components of that, and eventually switched over to the security architecture and data protection team, just kind of looking at the big picture. And data protection is a big thing over there at Visa, obviously, as it is with any company, but especially in the financial services space and dealing with highly regulated data. We did some cutting edge things. We were doing cloud before cloud was really an acceptable thing to do in financial services. We're talking way back in 2013, 2014. Mm-hmm. The word AWS was incredibly taboo amongst all the retail / commercial and wholesale banks. So the fact that a payment company was looking at it was pretty interesting, but a lot of lessons learned, which I'll be happy to talk about here in a bit. But after about 3 years at Visa, there was a changing of the guard at the CEO level, and that happens. And so the culture changed a little bit. New leadership came in, and it just didn't feel right, like the right fit anymore. Gartner had come after me and said that, hey, we could use an analyst, and I wasn't entirely sure that I wanted to go to be a Gartner. I just knew that at that moment, Visa didn't feel like the right fit for me. I went to Gartner, and I will say next to Cisco, Gartner was my favorite role. I was only there for a year, but Gartner was great, and it really opened my eyes to the analyst community, which is really important when business decision makers are out there trying to look at the market and understand what's out there. And admittedly, Gartner has a fluffy side. That's what we see with the Magic Quadrant and the hype cycle and all that. But they've also got a very deep tech side, which is where I worked, which is the Gartner for Technical Professionals. And they write the really detailed research papers. We're talking 30, 40 page long papers that probably no one reads, front to back, but nonetheless covers some very good topics in depth, as well as some consulting work there. And then the crew that was at Visa, a bunch of us had left, and a bunch of us then decided to reassemble at a company at the time was called Vantiv. Vantiv then bought WorldPay and took the name. The WorldPay then got bought by FIS, and as with most M&A, just the leadership of the old company was just not necessary, and no harm, no foul. I'm not bitter about it. It wasn't my first M&A, but took some time off. Unfortunately, it happened right at the start of COVID, so it was not a great from a timing perspective.
Right.
But ended up at Trace3, which is a systems integrator, and they asked me to come in and sort of revamp and run the architecture and engineering team over here, and this is where I've been for almost 6 months now.
Got it. Wow, what a storied career, Mike. I mean,
it's been a good one.
You've done a bunch of stuff. I can see where you and I could certainly talk for a while about the old days. So let's talk about cloud. And you implied earlier you'd had some early lessons. Long history with the cloud providers. You mentioned you've been using AWS back when it wasn't appropriate to say you were using them within a financial organization, it seemed. Yeah.
Well, and I'd even used AWS when I was at Cisco before my time at Visa. Some of the banks, and I'd worked with pretty much a who's who of the North American and Western European banks. Pretty much the top 5 in every region. So the issue was, of course, is just who owns that data, the access to that data, and we just didn't have the tools that we have today that help us with visibility, config management, just general data governance as a whole. Things that we don't dare let go to the cloud without having those programs in place today. So it was still very much the Wild West, to use that euphemism a little loosely there. But private cloud was a thing still. Cisco and NetApp had, of course, FlexPod. VMware had their whole software-defined data center. Microsoft was toying with the idea of Hyper-V. It really wasn't a thing quite yet, but they liked the idea. And of course, good old-fashioned Sun Microsystems. They had their virtual box, which eventually was an Oracle offering nowadays. But we had some cloud-based tooling to understand the basics of virtualization and how to keep secure systems separate from each other, how to protect that data, how to do things like tie-in identity. But there really wasn't a big, large-scale program for security and virtualization quite yet. People would use the word Cisco, for example, sold not the ASAV. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but Cisco did have a virtual machine firewall as an example, and then so did Checkpoint, and then eventually so did Palo. But they were very different devices back in 2010 versus what we have today, which is just virtualized versions of the actual hardware, or if anything, they're just delivering the virtualized instances these days. So we really didn't have that. We had different sets of tooling back then, and it wasn't as intelligent. It wasn't as integrated. But if you look at the public cloud specifically, there was really nothing in that space outside of what Amazon specifically was offering. IBM kind of had their quote unquote cloud, but really back in 2010, 2011, it was a one horse show. It was pretty much AWS. And as a rule, we just, as financial services companies, it just was a big, huge no-no for us to even try to go in there, because we couldn't guarantee the data. We couldn't guarantee the privacy of that data. And we just didn't have the visibility quite yet.
Right. Well, it was, really early back then.
Yeah, very early.
For sure. And, it's interesting, I was listening to you, I was just thinking about and reminded, in fact, I worked for what was really the industry's first purpose-built virtual firewall. It was a company, first they were called Vbrix, and then Altor Networks was what they became, and then Juniper ended up buying them.
Right.
And your comments about the new capabilities needed new tools, right? We had to see vMotion and inter-VM communications. But when I think about cloud, we're really talking vernacular and word choice, because it's virtualization is arguably one of the key cores of the cloud. Right. And more people seem to remember that as an era. It's just interesting how cloud has kind of become this word we banty around. And really, it's compute somewhere else. And we've had that for a long time, haven't we?
We have, having CPU cycles and storage, not in my data center or not local to my host. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is really nothing new to that. Where I think that cloud really began to differentiate itself and become the term we know as cloud is a combination of elasticity. So the ability to rapidly expand my adoption of a service while other people also do so without a degradation in service and being able to have that in a near instantaneous fashion, but also the integration of a lot of these toolkits, and I can look at it from a compute standpoint. I can look at this from a security standpoint. I look at this from an application standpoint. But nonetheless, it's all these services coming together in a way that is both distributed, that is elastic, and that is on demand. And I think that's really what came to define cloud. But of course, the joke still persists: is that a cloud is just someone else's computer.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, that's still somewhat true.
It is, but your point, I think, in the days of the 3090, and I was actually selling in a previous podcast, I was talking about how British Petroleum was a big IBM PC on every desktop, but they were a big DEC shop, and in fact bought the first DEC 9000 on the planet. And what was kind of going nerdy again, you could tunnel an AppleTalk protocol inside of DECnet and leverage what was then a global network before we had the internet. We're talking middle 80s, right? And so it was pretty extraordinary because I did a demo, and the key was that I could then demonstrate the user interface that all of us look at and expect every day. But back then, as you know, the user interface on a PC was DOS-based. Right. On a VT 52, 100, 200 terminal, 220, it was not a whole lot better. And it was, really the Macintosh that had that interface that we all kind of are accustomed to. And to be able to demonstrate how they could move and shuttle around their protocol, their packets, but do it, masquerading with the Macintosh interface, blew them away. And now, it's kind of amazing how we've taken that for granted. But the benefits you talk about, Mike, I think are spot on. It's the agility, it's the elasticity, it's the heaving, breathing, almost seemingly alive, that makes cloud different than that mainframe that really I ran out of memory and I had to buy more. Right. It was still kind of in that modality of owning a really, really, really big PC.
Right. Yep. It's true. Well, it's funny you mentioned mainframes though, because there are a lot of parallels between what we're doing with cloud computing and what mainframes had the potential to do.
Yes.
And it's been interesting seeing that, just being that I've been around mainframes most of my career. I mean, choose your bank. If it's a big bank and they're doing payments, or even insurance carriers, they still make heavy use of mainframes.
Absolutely. So those big batch jobs, man,
yeah,
where
absolutely.
They collect that data all day. Yeah.
They're predictable, they're reliable, they're highly available, and it doesn't matter if you throw one packet at them or 1,000 packets at it, they're going to respond the same to each and every one in a very predictable pattern. But the point being is that cloud is sort of, it is a bit of a controversial stance, I freely admit, but cloud really is that next iteration of what the vision of mainframes were supposed to be. Now, that's simplifying this quite a bit. But mainframes had that on-demand CPU availability.
Sure.
They were the original elastic computer. It was not like elasticity that I see at my AWS and Azure. But if I have an IBM Xeos machine and I need more capacity, I just add more frames to it. If I need more storage, then I call up EMC or Pure and attach a new SAN array to that. And that was the model that enterprises were using for a while. And now we've just shifted it. Now we no longer have the capital expenditures of buying these gigantic boxes. Instead, we have the OpEx of paying Amazon, Microsoft, and Google a ton of money every month. But at the end of the day, the model is I'm not going to say the same, but is fairly similar as far as what it's able to deliver. How it delivers is obviously very different, but what it's delivering is really not that far removed from what we used to do.
Yep. No, you're exactly right. In fact, on an earlier podcast where I had Ed Amoruso, who was the past CISO from AT&T, and we were talking about mainframes, and that was one of the things he welcomed, the consolidation of compute that cloud is bringing, much more analogous, as you put, to the mainframe environment. It has its real advantages, right? And when you combine in the capabilities now with this DevOps, DevSecOps, the whole notion of that elasticity and agility being implemented at the development level, that's pretty exciting. But man, the nerds they're taking over the world.
All of us kids that were doing BBSs and modems back in the 80s, and then our kids, the millennials and Gen Z who are out there and have really transformed everything to be code driven. And that's just a big shift in my career. That once upon a time, if I was a network engineer, network architect, or security engineer, doing everything as code was not really something that we did. We did config management, which was its own sort of code, but it's nothing like a C# or a Java or anything like that. Right. And it was proprietary per vendor. But now we've shifted everything to where the generation after me has come in, and they're now delivering everything via code. Infrastructure is code, config is code, and we're using the cloud to facilitate this move. And we're abstracting the Junipers and the Ciscos and the Aristos from the world and reducing them to code snippets that we leverage a platform like an Ansible or a Salt or a Terraform or something like that to deliver it. It has been a pretty big change. And I think that's change. It's been a really interesting change, but it's
hasn't it relegated that next layer, if you will, that what used to be those highly proprietary hardware guys? That game's changing big time now.
It is.
Now it's just, what's your horsepower?
Right.
I don't care about I don't use a proprietary OS. What's your horsepower? What's your throughput? Right? That's it.
It's true. Well, and it's also kind of changed the barriers to entry, because you think about to even go back to the year 2000, to get a good job in networking or systems, you had to have your MCSE or one of the Cisco CC level certs, or the CCNA, CCNP, CCIE.
Right.
And it's not that those things aren't still important, because you still have networks, you still have operating systems, but by moving all these things to code, and I look at my 13-year-old son who's become very proficient in both Java and Python, is that even he now, as long as he knows the objects that he's trying to configure, can just now generically call an interface from a programming language of his choice, whether again it's Ruby or Python or JavaScript, and then we'll let the language take all the difficulty out of it. The compiler will say, oh, well, this is a Cisco target, so I need to call it this way. Right. Well, my son doesn't need to know that level of detail, and it sort of reduced the barrier of entry for other people to get into tech, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, tech has been first and foremost a boys' club for a long time.
Yeah.
It's largely been a white boys' club, and there's that's how it is. But I think
changing too. Yeah,
it's rapidly changing, and I think part of this transformation that we're seeing in that we are simplifying the stack and trying to use common interfaces for these things. I think it's really helped lower the barriers to entry, and I really think we can thank cloud or blame blame cloud, depending on your point of view, but thank cloud for getting us here, because it's sort of returned this compute environment, I don't want to say to the people because I sound like a revolutionary, but it's sort of brought this back to where anybody can get into it and do it now without having those 4 years of specialized education and spending years on getting every cert in the book. And again, I think there's value in certification. I think there's value in university-based education, but I think we are slowly but surely lowering the barrier to entry and making it simpler for anyone to pick this up and get into this sort of environment.
Yeah, I would agree. And Mike, if let's go back a few years, 30 years or so, we could see this cycle has occurred. Think desktop publishing. Right. I mean, that was revolutionary. And you had to be, the owner of a Mergenthaler, a Linotronic or something like that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and understand how to actually even program it to print these high quality fonts and styles, right? That game changed. And we saw it over and over in music, right? I mean, I can keep going, right? We've seen these cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're seeing them come to a point where all technology, and again, the cloud, I think, is really what has helped deliver this. But, where you no longer have to be this very well-trained digital artist in order to configure your newsletter, or you had to set up your music production or your synthesis, or really even game programming has high-end game programming still needs very specialized skills. But I've got my 7-year-old daughter sitting there making checkers and chess games using something like Scratch, and so it's greatly simplified how people get into this.
Yeah.
And you don't need that. You don't need to be the person who's the only game in town, because now anybody can become one of the games in town. And I think that's been a big benefit for us as a whole.
Well, certainly ubiquitous connectivity, SaaS, and the ability to deliver at such blazing speeds, the content, those are game changers, right? And certainly they've changed from a development perspective when I can have multiple releases in a day as opposed to a few in a year. Those are just additional changes. So one of the things I always like to ask is, from your experience, give us some cautionary tales, maybe some recommendations on things that you've learned that you would caution those that are maybe at earlier stages of their migration and evolution into the cloud?
Well, I can tell you that the most beneficial lesson that I learned, and thankfully I learned it before, again, cloud was really becoming a big thing in the enterprise networks, is that it's a chance for you to reset and really rethink what you want to deliver and how you want to deliver it. And I'll give you sort of a generic story. I'm sure they wouldn't appreciate me giving all the details, but when I was at Visa, again, early adopters, we were thinking very hard about how do we get into the cloud. Again, I'll freely admit, in 2013, 2014, we were still pretty naive about this sort of thing. But we decided to really copy and paste our corporate data center security policy and apply that to an AWS cloud-based security policy. And it was not only a spectacular failure, financially speaking, we all got a very, very expensive education out of this because we had to pull everything back. So my first and foremost advice to anybody who hasn't made that jump to cloud yet is toss out the book that you've used in your traditional data center today and really rethink everything. Obviously, I'm going to speak from the side of security these days, and I'll tell my security practitioners out there, don't take the baggage that you have accumulated, and we've all accumulated baggage in our data centers. You joke about AppleTalk and DECnet. I found some IPX out there as recent as 4 years ago, and that's some old NetWare stuff. Now, I don't think anyone would try to copy that out there, but nonetheless, if you're doing an assessment of your data center and saying, oh, I still need to support IPX, well, you're not going to find that in an Amazon. So get rid of that already, obviously, and that's a low-hanging fruit. That's an obvious one. But really, it's about rethinking your strategy and really allowing you to look at things like tool simplification and looking at how do I make my business operation processes, not even my technology processes, just my business processes. How do I make them simpler? How can I leverage this elastic, highly available, highly resilient thing to make my business processes even easier? And that can be something as simple as how do I onboard new suppliers or new partners, through an extranet? Can I use something rather than home run all these WAN connections to my data center? Can I create a partner portal that's on a different interface for my application in the cloud and onboard them that way? That way I can get my time to market quicker. If I'm automating things like identity or creating those credentials and then granting access, I can do a lot of that automated in the cloud with largely a click of the button, which is something that not everyone has done to get that maturity level in their enterprise yet. So it's about rethinking my tools. It's about rethinking my processes. And it's also about putting things in the cloud that belong in the cloud. I'm going to give a terrible example, but let's say that M365, Office 365 didn't exist. Let's say that Exchange Online was not a thing. But in that world, putting something like in your Exchange server on AWS would be a terrible idea. It's just really not built for that. That's not a good use of it. Right. But my web presentation layer, or maybe some of these APIs that I use to run aspects of my business, well, that's a great use case for a cloud-based environment. So things that are largely clientless, or it's using a browser as a client, great use cases of that. Things that are traditional client server, where I've got a thick piece of software on my endpoint that's not a browser. In this case, let's stick with the Exchange. So I've got Outlook. That's my client, and then I've got Exchange in the cloud. That's really not a great use case. Can you do it? Of course you can do it. Yeah. But is that really getting you any benefit other than shifting the burden from one location to another? And that's really what it comes down to is I'm not really buying myself anything of that. So it's about making sure that what you put into the cloud is both going to take advantage of that and that you realize a benefit, whether it's velocity, whether it's simplification, whether it's getting away from, again, the rest of the baggage that you have on premise that has either created a security strategy that's really hard to get around, or a networking strategy that introduces unnecessary latency or unnecessary hops. Getting that stuff out of your old school data center and put it into the cloud is really one of those huge benefits. But again, I just need to stress it. It's about rethinking everything in your strategy, but I could literally go off on just security alone because that's my bread and butter.
Yeah, shake the Etch-a-Sketch. That's what I always tell people.
Pretty much.
Literally, we've continued to, it seems, on-prem anyway, haven't erased the blackboard, but we've just kept adding to it. And I think we're at a point where we kind of got to stop, clean it all, and start fresh. There's so many tools. If you make the mistake of just jumping in, dragging along that trail of old tools, thinking this is going to work with that field of view, right? Those glasses, so to speak, you're going to mess up.
Absolutely. Well, and you're not going to realize the benefits of why you're moving to the cloud in the first place. And you're just taking the problems you had in your existing data center and you're now shifting them to the cloud, which may actually even amplify it. And that's what we experienced when I was at Visa, is that we tried to just generically put some systems that had nothing to do with payments themselves. So we never put customer data in the cloud at that time. I don't know what Visa has done since I've left, but it was mostly just like reporting systems and batch jobs that were in the back end because we didn't have the ability at that moment to expand our on-premise data centers. But we looked at some just basic reporting functionality and batch jobs moving out there. But we made the process worse because myself, and I was the team lead on the security side that did this, so I'll take the blame for it. We just, we said, well, this is how we do it here. This is how we're going to do it over there.
Sure.
And of course, this is how we've always done it is one of the worst answers you can give, especially for security and especially with new technology. And,
although that's, in your defense, I guess, Mike, let's face it, man, couple of decades and then some, we did things the same way with very few significant transformations. This whole thing that Amazon invented, I think it's an interesting point to make. They invented this environment out of need.
Right.
And if you really analyze what Amazon was doing and the pressures they were feeling, they solved business problems with this technology. It's really extraordinary. But I think it's fair to say they didn't drag all the old stuff from their on-premise data center to come up with this new vision. And so I think that just really highlights the critical need to shake the Etch-a-Sketch and make sure you plan. That's the other thing that I think people sometimes forget, because things like identity, right, Mike? I mean, in the cloud, identity takes a much broader role, doesn't it?
I would argue that identity and data protection, so it's not just cryptography, but it's general data governance. So where my data is at, identifying that data, protecting that data. I would say that identity and data protection are more important than your traditional perimeter defenses, which makes up a bulk of your security program at large enterprise data centers. So you think of the firewall, the threat prevention, or /IPS and your WAFs and all that. And don't get me wrong, those are important in certain cases, but they have less importance in the cloud than identity was. And you look at, there's been a handful of companies over the years where they've had their credentials compromised, and either the company was deleted. Look at Code Spaces as a great example of that, or all that data is lost, all the backups are lost, and you're basically erased from AWS or Azure or GCP. That makes identity even more critical, especially around that billing account or those privileged accounts, because I can do things from home without actually breaching your perimeter, because I can reach AWS, I can reach Azure from here. If I've got your credentials and you don't have proper security around that, or proper ways to limit how certain privileged identities are able to get into my environment, I can do some pretty significant damage. And you look at all the companies that are born in the cloud these days, I can erase you and get you gone. So,
well, in fact, from anywhere on the planet. Right. I mean, that's the thing. And in one of my other presentations, I would tell people, quoting the late, great Yogi Berra, right? It's deja vu all over again. And what I'm referring to was how sprawl was a problem the first go round with virtualization. Right? Yep. Oh, geez, I didn't know he was doing that. But in every instance, it was in your environment. There was your ESX server, and you finally got the tools to give you the visibility. Now, we're talking a little bit higher propensity of sprawl, wouldn't you think?
Right. Absolutely. Well, that brings up a great point, because sprawl is still a problem in the cloud, especially because it's on demand. And so me as an end user, it's in my mind, it's free. I know it's not free, but I'm not paying for it.
Yep.
And how expensive can it be? So, sprawl is still a problem, which is why when you mentioned earlier, when you go to the cloud, having that plan in place is critical. And I'm not bagging on developers at all, because developers make the world go around. But I think it's important that you get the CIO and the CISO's organization to lead on this, because developers want to make their lives easier, and they want to use the tools that can enhance their product rapidly and get those multiple releases out per day, per week, per month, whatever it might be. But at the same time, those tools might have either added attack surface or have inadvertent data exposures that can get you in trouble. So, while yes, going to the cloud can be a great thing, and there's a certain level of ease of access to it. It's also making sure that you're doing it in a controlled fashion, not because you want to be a blocker. Quite the opposite. I believe security and infrastructure can be enablers for this. It's just setting up the guardrails and making sure that we're using the tools correctly, because not everyone's going to be security conscious, and that's what it is. But
it's funny. I got to just mention, so previous podcast had TJ Gonen, who heads cloud security products. And, one of the things he likes to say is, he doesn't like the term guardrails. He doesn't.
That's true.
He doesn't. No, but hang on. He likes paved roads. To kind of get them off of the gravel roads, pave a road for them. They're going to be able to go faster on that paved road. I really think it's both. I really think it's both, because especially with drift. And let's stay in the vehicle analogy. I mean, if I'm going around a corner at a very high rate of speed, there's G-forces that are just doing all they can to pull me off that road, right? I mean, and so developers are moving at the speed of cloud. Those guardrails, if they have to run up against them, at least they can keep that forward momentum, but stay on the pavement. I think that there's place for both, I guess, is what I'm suggesting.
And I agree. I think it's the infrastructure and security folks setting that up, that on-ramp, so that developers can get their car on the road. And then when the developers realize that, hey, this one-lane road might need to become a 2 or a 3-lane road, it's important that those conversations occur. And it's important that security and infrastructure stays on top of that, which I think is probably the biggest sin that security organizations have done. And look, I did it. I did it at Visa. I did it at WorldPay. It was very, very hard to stay ahead of developers because they're seeing those new tool releases the day that they happen, and we won't see them until someone goes, hey, by the way.
Did you see how Mike implemented that new tool? I mean, that's how you find out about it, right?
Right.
Somebody says, hey, it's so cool. Did you see it? I mean, remember when virtualization came out, Mike? I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. Chris came into my office and he said, hey, take a look at this. And he steps on, grabs my keyboard, taps a little bit, and the next thing I see he's redirected, and now he's booting an appliance. Yeah. I was stunned because up until then, we had to pay for those appliances that got shipped to us, and they had RMAs and they had returns, and we had big customers in India that we had cross-shipment agreements with, and surprisingly, we would cross-shipment but not always receive the returns. Right. It had huge cost consequences, and when I found out we had a license to print money, because that's what really virtualization was. But I mean, it was really extraordinary. And now when I hear about pets and farm animals, right? That analogy, right? A pet is something you keep and nurture and take care of. The cloud's a farm animal where, you kill it and you get another one.
I like that one.
I don't know if you've heard, I imagine you have, of, the cycle used to be you'd patch, you'd update, and now literally it's just tear down, rebuild, because you can script it all. It can all be based on infra as code. You start fresh every day. Yeah.
Well, that's been one of the greatest boons of virtualization in general, but the evolution of cloud and the technologies that came with it, especially containers, is that the whole concept of attack surface management, which includes vulnerability management and patch management, has become greatly simplified, because now to your point, I'm no longer patching systems. I'm patching gold images, and the next time I refresh those containers or those virtual machines, they're getting the latest image that gets uploaded into that space. So I already know I'm getting patched, and I don't have to sit there and worry about when am I going to patch this system and take it down, because more than likely I've got a cycle in place where I know that every Sunday night, for example, I'm gonna switch from my blue side to my green side on my container environment, or I'm going to flip all these VMs. I'm going to switch my load balancing to go to the standby. I'm going to refresh the primary, and then next week I'm going to switch back to the primary, and my standby side is going to get its patches as well. So it has so simplified that. But absolutely, in that, tear down the environment, rebuild it, and off you go and continue with that new functionality.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, it's just, going back to the comments and discussions we were having earlier, when we literally would have to see if anybody was on the phone and then go through the whistle and scratch and pray and hope that you see a connect to where we are today, where we're literally building new data centers, new environments, boom. Just like that. I wanted to touch on one thing that you mentioned earlier, because I think this is a problem that is going to manifest itself and surface itself much, much more as we move on into this cloud native world. And I'm specifically talking about the plausibility of access because of many different services, microservices, components need to talk to one another to make an application, in quotes, where before it was in my data center, it was monolithic, it's all right there.
Yeah, and that's where concepts like zero trust start to come into play. That's not the only solution. I don't think zero trust by itself would have fixed that. But we look at these new operating models that are coming about because of the result of cloud. You look at just user access. The Ciscos, the Force Points, and the Palo Altos of the world, they call it SASE. Yeah. So that's one way for me as the enterprise to govern how my users connect, make sure that all my users are connecting in a similar fashion, and that in turn leads to zero trust, where I can now make real-time decisions based on where they're coming from, the type of device they're using, time of day, environment they're trying to access, and now I can make real-time decisions about what sort of permissions I want those users to have. If I log in as an administrator, sort of like a network admin or a server admin, then I get certain rights and certain protocols through the firewalls and able to do these things. Whereas if I'm just an app developer, I get a completely separate set of entitlements that I can then use to do that. But I think that we're still, as an industry, figuring out how to deal with some of these things. And you use the Capital One attack, where there's a little bit of insider, a little bit of carelessness in general, and you see
a new paradigm, a completely new world that is arguably still getting figured out. Sometimes we underestimate how complex this has become. Look at, just the whole solar winds thing, right? I mean, it was pretty amazing. But this is where, a lot of people don't ever, if there was a massive ship off the coast of California and it had a foreign logo, we would be responding in a big way. Right? If it was Iran or China or something, right? And what I think is amazing is how few people on the planet really have no clue how fierce and how frequently that happens in the world of cyber. It's every day, all the time.
Well, and I think it's compounded by the fact that we're always in the middle of a new cycle, but this cycle specifically, which is really how we operate. So this is the first major shift in an operational cycle that we've had in about a decade, when virtualization first came, and virtualization was that disruptor, and now cloud is that next disruptor in that. And we'll have one after cloud, but I think we're right in the smack in the middle of it, where I've got one leg in the old world with those monolithic technologies, and I've got that hard exterior and soft interior, and I've got the other leg in this cloud environment where all my security paradigms I've always used, they're not necessarily out the window, but their importance and their focus has changed. And so as a result, I don't have a clean one-size-fits-all approach where
it's
I can
lumpy.
say,
It's
It
lumpy.
is.
Yeah, to go from the 26 controls that you so seamlessly had assembled in your on-prem and then trying to uniformly apply those same. Fact is, they don't even exist, in all instances. So I totally get it. And this is, I think, going back to your earlier point, right? To really think it through and plan ahead of time and not go in assuming you're going to do it like you used to do it.
Right. Exactly. And that's at the end of the day, that's still going to be the guidance is throw out the way that you've always done it. And let's think of a new way without this baggage.
Yep.
And even let's think of new ways to use the tools. And I'll give a great example of that. Most large enterprises, so companies of about 5,000 or so users or more, which granted is not a huge overall population of the companies out there, but those that are like that, they wield a lot of power and they buy a lot of stuff. Those types of companies, 5,000 users or more, tend to have 6 to 8 dozen different security tools, and this has been validated by, I remember Symantec was the first one to put it out. Gartner and Forrester have had similar versions of those reports with different numbers, but if just from security alone I'm using 60 to 80 different tools, that's kind of silly. And so me going into the cloud is the way for me to go in there and cut it down from 60 or 80 different tools down to maybe a dozen or 2 dozen tools that not only integrate together, which is the key piece here, is making them work together to have better coverage. Yep. But again, simplifying my operations. I shouldn't have to go to 4 different consoles to change a rule. Yep. I should be able to script it. I should be able to push it, and I should be able to validate it, and I'm done. And hopefully it's touching those other systems that are affected by this as well in that same process. So this is a way to simplify that. And I think until we get to that point, which we're probably still a good 3 or 4 years away from that, I see 2024, 2025 as being when this cloud bonanza finally begins to die down and we start looking at the next thing after that. And of course, no one knows what that is quite yet. But I think until then, we're going to be in this nebulous space where we're throwing a lot of tooling at the problem, but it's only putting Band-Aids on it. And part of it is us, the practitioners. Part of it is the cloud vendors themselves, and part of it's just the tooling infrastructure and making sure that rather than everyone being a me too or just doing one part of the puzzle, you've got companies that are really being progressive and looking at the big picture and trying to deliver on all of it. Maybe not being the best on all of it, but looking ways to simplify it and really helping customers, make that jump to the cloud in a way that is controlled, but at the same time gives them that flexibility and velocity to do what they need to do, but with the assurance that the CISO and their team can sleep at night saying, okay, well, we should be safe. We shouldn't have these breach issues that we've been concerned about in the past. And that's whoever comes up with that first is going to be able to print money.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'm a big proponent of and big believer of is that the industry needs to step back. So often we say, hey, let's dig into the grains of sand. Let's go into the details. And I think we need to step back because to your point, 60, 70 different products, even 20, 30, 40 different products when we're talking about different UIs, different all the associated things. And that's not even considering the relationship, the contracts, the legal, the termination, the shipping, receiving, accounts payable, accounts receivable, support. I mean, on and on and on. This is why we really are due for some consolidation. And I would also dispute that back in the days when I carried around a phone from Nokia and a laptop from wherever, it was a different world. Okay. But the world we're in today, I'm carrying around a supercomputer that has an app that's a phone that is connected to the same data and information and tools that my laptop, my desktop, my tablet are all connected to. So something's changed. And what I believe has changed is now because of this hyper-connected world we're in, the real prize is not the pictures on my my phone, Mike. The prize is what my phone is connected to, because I use it for work and home and play. And so I really think we would benefit from harmonizing, from homogenizing our defenses behind a common threat intelligence. It's not to say that any one vendor can do it all. I think we all know that the minute you start to look at the vendors that offer a broad enough portfolio that makes it worth considering, the herd goes from 3,000-4,000 down to maybe 10.
Right.
And I think that that's got to be the trend. Look, if you did it with us, Checkpoint, you're still going to have to go and buy a SIM and buy some other tools. We don't do it all, and no other vendor does it all. But I think that there's going to be some trends towards that. And I know, a little plug for the hand that feeds me, we've really made some very, very exciting announcements just at the beginning of the year to unify and harmonize your network, your cloud, and your workforce.
Well,
right.
And I think Checkpoint's really, gotten on top of that, and some of the competitors, is that we're moving away from this product centric approach where buy my firewall, and then later on we come back and buy my IPS, and we come back later, buy my VPN, and now instead, we're selling a platform. Yeah. And I really see that as being the enabler to simplify, especially once again looking at cloud, is that I'm going to buy a platform that deals with my traditional security.
Well,
that
cloud,
deals with
not to interrupt
cloud.
You, Mike,
right.
but cloud has become this incredibly broad platform.
It has.
The need for a tool that covers everything from, duplicate my network perimeter kind of security all the way to shifting left and infra as code and Kubernetes. There's so much there, and the same thing is occurring, right? You're seeing this fragmentation on point solutions, that this solution is great for doing code analysis without any agents before you push it out for doing serverless or infra as code, for example, right? And some of those tools are really cool. But I think they're going to have to become a platform, aren't? I mean, I don't know. What's your thoughts on that? Because it seems like we kind of could really benefit from having a platform, but then there's always going to be something that somebody does that you're going to want, I suspect.
Right. Well, and I think that's the hard part as a consumer, and I look at this being as part of a systems integrator, is that I can come to the table with three platforms or three different vendors, and one of those vendors offers everything soup to nuts that you think you could possibly need, but the truth is that either maybe that platform doesn't perform as well in the areas that are important to that customer, or it's got a bunch of stuff that they just don't need, and they can get away with this much smaller boutique vendor that only does two things, but they do those two things better than everybody else. Right. And then on top of that, that meets those customers' needs. But I think you're right, is that you're going to need those platforms that whether I'm looking at infrastructure or whether I'm looking at back ends and the whole DevSecOps process, because there's still a rather large disconnect between the two. Yeah. But I see the need for platforms being for both of those separately today, and then eventually those platforms merging, because we're already seeing that marriage, but we're not seeing it enough, I think, that anyone has truly invested in this unified platform that's doing traditional infrastructure, or in this case cloud infrastructure, and then marrying it with the dev pipeline and the development cycles itself. You see some playing around in that space. Yeah. There certainly are a lot of vendors in that space, but we're not seeing the maturity and the completeness of vision yet, and I think that's what we'll see next from a product standpoint over the next 18 months. It's going to be interesting to see that evolve. Yeah,
it's the one thing I've said this for a long time, Mike, is I think one of the most exciting things about this industry is no matter when you're getting into it, you're getting in at the beginning of something.
Right, absolutely.
And it makes it really, really a lot of fun. So listen, this has been awesome, and you and I could go for a while. So I know I want to have you back. But for the sake of your your time. I'm gonna say thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed our conversation. Again, it's really fun talking to somebody that's had the tenure in the industry, so that you can just have some really fun conversations. So thank you so very, very much for joining me, Mike.
Well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it, and this was great. This was a good time.
No,
so
the one thing, I did want to make a plug, and I apologize. Now, if I've got someone listening or we've got clients, Trace 3, you guys are the go-to guys that really can kind of be that agnostic, neutral party to help me, aren't you?
We try to be. We've got a focus in the cloud DevSecOps space. That's my partner Jimmy, and then you've got me on the cloud infrastructure side, and we've got teams that work for us, and we are working really hard to making sure that people are making the right decisions. We're taking that experience and trying to translate that, but we also go beyond that. We're looking at the zero trust. We're looking at the SASE architectures. We're looking at how do we make business simpler? How do we use technology to make business simpler? And it's a big thing we pride ourselves on. So it's a competitive market space, though.
Sure.
There's a lot out there, but we think we do it pretty well, and I appreciate the plug there.
Yeah, well, no problem. I saw Cohesity was one of your partners, and in fact, I had Michael Litchin on the program just last week. So, well, hey, Mike, thanks again.
Thank you for having me on.
I really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, another one's in the books. This was a really good one. I told you were going to enjoy Mike. The guy is obviously very, very knowledgeable and long in the tooth, as they say in the world of cloud and a lot of other computing environments. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. And if you like what you're hearing, please tell your friends, share, subscribe, like, and we'll look forward to having you back on the next episode of Talking Cloud.